Hello and welcome to the RSK Biocensus first Thursday Club of April. I'm Tim Hounson. I'm the Managing Director of RSK Biocensus, and today we're going to hear from Dr. Pete Walker, who is our newly appointed Technical Director and specialises in aquatics. I understand Pete's going to introduce himself, so I'll leave it there for that. But before we crack on, there's some housekeeping to talk about. For those of you that are new to us, we mute everybody's microphones during the presentation for obvious reasons, but we still want to hear from you. So throughout the presentation, you can add questions to the question box, and at the end of the presentation, we'll run through a short Q&A session. So just drop them in as he's talking, and then we'll cover those at the end. After the presentation, we will send out a questionnaire via email, and we would really appreciate your feedback, good or bad, or indifferent even, because it helps us refine what we're doing with the First Thursday Club. But anyway, without further ado, I will hand you over to Pete. Thanks, Pete.
Hey, thanks very much, Tim. Right. So, what do we think? Thanks everyone for joining. You can see here, this is briefly what we're going to cover today. So I'll just introduce myself and the RSK Biocensus business for those of you that don't know who I am or who the business is. We'll briefly mention some key bits of legislation and then move on to talk about the types of aquatic habitats that may crop up on some of your sites. And of course, some of the species that may need consideration within those habitats. And then for the second half of the presentation, I'm going to bring up some case studies. So I've got quite a few in there just to try and give a sort of overview of some of the different types of sites that I think you're most likely to work on, and particularly include some of those sites that perhaps might get missed. So when aquatic ecology might perhaps be overlooked, which could cause problems further down the line. I do apologise, I've got a bit of a cold, so if you hear me coughing or spluttering at the end, I do apologise for that, but hopefully there won't be too much of that. So this is me. I've got a background in marine and freshwater biology. That was my bachelor's degree, and then I did a master's that had more of an aquaculture focus, and that was in applied fish biology. And my PhD research was focused on fish health, fish stress, and predominantly fish parasitology. I had about 6 years as a research scientist, did all sorts of investigations focusing on various aquatic ecology topics, including fish parasitology, invasive crustaceans, fish health, fish ecology, and sustainable aquaculture. And then I went on to become an ecological consultant, specialising predominantly in freshwater fisheries ecology. But I've also worked on a wide array of projects, including water quality, fish and eel passage and screening, fish rescues, pollution incidents, habitat restoration, etc. And I've done my fair share of estuarine and marine work too. So just a little bit about RSK Biocensus. So we've got about 120 in-house staff covering every ecological discipline, including aquatic and terrestrial ecology. But our team is also supported by a pre-approved subcontractor network of more than 750 ecologists, including generalists and some specialists. And if you look at the map on the right hand side, I think this one's actually a little bit outdated now, but this shows the location of our different offices. The little pink blobs and the little green blobs are ones where we've got ecologists based. So you can see we've got a pretty decent coverage throughout the UK there. And in terms of what we cover, if it's ecology related, I'd be very surprised if we couldn't help you with it, usually from our in-house resources, but if not, we do have the subcontractor network that we can draw upon. A little bit then about aquatic ecology at Biocensus before we move on to the presentation proper, so to speak. So the list you can see on screen covers the majority of things that we can do in-house, ranging from habitat assessments and surveys to species-specific surveys, water quality investigations, bathymetric surveying, fish passage and screening studies, and of course fish rescues and fish translocations. So moving on then, we'll take a quick look at legislation. I did plan on talking a lot more about this in this presentation, but there's actually quite a lot to fit into a 30-minute slot today. And I felt the case studies might be more suitable based on some of the things that people have been asking me to talk about over the last couple of years. So We will touch on legislation briefly in the next couple of slides, but I think what we're going to do is run a separate webinar on legislation later this year, so watch this space for that one. Basically, legislation is what makes it legal or illegal to do something, and if you don't abide by it, then you can find yourself in some pretty hot water. There are several bits of legislation that often crop up in aquatic ecology, and we're just going to touch on some of those in the next slide. So these first 2 points are essentially covering protected species and habitats. Specific species and habitats are detailed within that legislation, and if you're found to be injuring, killing, or taking those species or disturbing the habitats that they're in, then you could find yourself in some pretty serious trouble. The next one on the list here is the Water Framework Directive. So that looks at protecting and improving water quality with specific focuses on physical, chemical, and biological components. So if you're planning on undertaking activities which might cause a deterioration in any of those components, then you need to have a think about that and what the implications of that might be. So that might be if you're physically altering a channel, or if you're going to be affecting the water quality in some way, shape, or form, and perhaps affecting species that are living there. You might want to be talking to an aquatic ecologist about how you can do that most sensitively, or ideally avoid doing that at all. Next one on the list here then is the Salmon and Freshwater Fisheries Act, or SAFA, and that aims to protect freshwater fisheries. So there are numerous offences listed under it, including activities which might affect fish movements at fish passes, fishing with unauthorised equipment, killing or injuring unclean or immature fish, or disturbing spawning fish, fish spawn, or spawning areas. Also, discharging matter or effluent that is poisonous or could cause injury to fish, fish spawn or spawning areas, or food of fish can constitute an offence. So it's important to note here that silt runoff, for example, from construction sites or agricultural fields could cause damage to fish spawning areas or fish spawn. So silt management is an important consideration for any construction site. Please do keep that in mind. And then the last one on the list that I just wanted to touch on today is the eels regs. So these came about as part of efforts to try and restore the stock of European eel following a catastrophic decline in numbers. Many of the offences associated with these regs relate to the sale or taking of eels, but there are also offences relating to the creation of obstruction to eel passage, or failure to provide eel passage facilities or appropriate screening to protect eels, for example. There are other bits of legislation that may be applicable in certain circumstances, so the NERC Act or environmental permitting regulations, for example. But as I said earlier, it's quite a big topic and probably one that needs a little bit more detail. So I think we'll cover that in a separate webinar. So what are the aquatic habitats that might be of concern or interest? So as we'll see in the next few slides, they're actually quite diverse. Pardon me. So we'll start here with the flowing habitats. And as you can see from the pictures that I put on the screen here, flowing waters, so rivers, streams, etc., come in a variety of shapes and sizes. I've heard quite a few times that there was a watercourse on site, but it didn't need considering because it was too shallow, or it looked too silty for anything to live in it. But aquatic life can live in the shallowest of water, and that includes fish. And some of the case studies that I'll show later on in this presentation will highlight that. And in fact, some of the smallest headwater streams can be those that are the most important, especially for species like white-club crayfish, or in some cases for spawning fish such as trout. So onto the still waters then. As with flowing waters, still waters, so ponds, lakes, etc., also come in a variety of shapes and sizes. Many smaller water bodies can be very important for local conservation reasons, including providing breeding habitat for amphibians and many invertebrate species, such as dragonflies and damselflies. And many larger still waters also have flowing water bodies that flow into or out of them. And these can affect the still water or be affected by the still water, particularly in the case of pollution or something like that, for example. And there are other types of habitats that don't quite fit into that flowing water or still water. And here I'm thinking about things such as canals or drainage channels and ditches. In the case of the smaller examples, the smaller ditches and things, they can often be discounted by people as they're often shallow and silty, but they can still be important for an array of wildlife. I've seen many a client surprised at the fish that we've caught in seemingly lifeless ditches. They're quite good at hiding, and there are also other different species, so certain types of snail, for example, that really favour these sorts of habitats. So we can't just discount them. So this next one then, the estuaries and marine. So up here we're talking about estuaries or transitional waters, coastal areas, salt marshes, and the open sea. As much as I'd like to, similar to legislation bit, we're not going to be able to cover all of these today because there just simply isn't time. But as with the legislation topic, I think we're going to plan to come back and talk to you specifically about these estuarine and marine environments in a dedicated webinar, perhaps even with our colleagues over in the RSK Marine team who are experts, particularly in those sort of coastal and open sea habitats. So watch this space for news on that webinar. So today's focus is going to be about fresh water then. So let's have a look at some of the species types that we might want to consider. I'm going to jump straight in with fish because in many cases it tends to be those animals that people start getting the most worried about or think about first when they're thinking about aquatic environments. There are lots of different species of fish. Several of them have formal protection, and there are sites designated because of their presence, and these might include lampreys or shad, for example. There are migratory species such as Atlantic salmon, the aforementioned lampreys and shad, sea trout, a migratory form of brown trout, and the species my colleagues accused me of never shutting up about, the European eel. I did actually think when I made these notes that was the first time I mentioned eel in this presentation, but of course I mentioned them when we talked about the eels regs, so there you go. And already going on about eel again, so we'll move on. We've also got species grouped together as coarse fish, so that includes things like barbel, chub, dace, pike, perch and roach, for example. And smaller species, sometimes referred to as minor species, and that might include bullhead, minnow, stone loach and the likes. And of course, there are also the non-native species with high priority species, including things like topmouth gudgeon or pumpkin seed. But there are other perhaps more familiar species which are also not native, and although they're quite familiar and quite prevalent throughout the UK, they can cause issues. And here I'm thinking of species like carp, so now very widespread, particularly because of the angling industry, and maybe some ornamental fish such as goldfish that have been either deliberately or accidentally released into water bodies, and they can cause quite severe problems for water quality and also carry diseases as well. And also we've got Wells catfish. There's a picture of a Wells catfish down the top right, actually. They can be quite problematic for our native wildlife as well. They can be quite destructive in terms of stirring up silt, uprooting plankton, and they're actually quite voracious predators. And in fact, if you Google Wells catfish, France and pigeons, there's quite a frightening set of videos online of Wells catfish snatching pigeons from shallow water along the banks of a French river, so it just shows how they can take our native wildlife, including birds. You wouldn't have thought birds would be at most risk from a fish, but there you go. One of the key things to remember about fish is the risk of committing an offence if you damage or kill fish, particularly spawning or immature fish, or if you damage spawning areas. All of the different species have their own spawning seasons, many of which overlap, but between them they can cover a large proportion of the year. So you need to be aware of that when planning works in or around watercourses that might have fish in them. Moving on to crayfish then, essentially there's two sides to this. So either you might be concerned that there are protected crayfish there, so our native white-clawed crayfish, or you might be concerned with a biosecurity risk associated with non-native crayfish, of which there are several different species, the commonest one being the American signal crayfish. There are a few protected macroinvertebrate species in addition to white-clawed crayfish, which I just mentioned, of course. But macroinvertebrate communities can also be used to inform on water quality and habitat type. For example, some species are good indicators of clean water, others are indicators of poor water quality, including pollution, and they can be useful in determining if an incident has occurred or what the extent of the impacts of that incident might be, for example. We can't forget about the plants. Our botanists would never forgive me. Plants are important in aquatic habitats as a food source for some species, refuges for others, and spawning habitat in some cases. They can be indicators of water quality or habitat disturbance, and they can be problematic too, certainly in the case of some invasive non-native species. The surveys for aquatic plants tend to describe baseline ecological conditions or characterize habitats, or they can be to identify risks associated with invasive species. And last but not least, or perhaps least, there are the tiny things. So here we're talking about planktonic organisms or diatoms, and they have a use in evaluating water quality. But in some cases, they can be problematic. So blue-green algae being a good example of that. So onto the case studies then. Let's see how many I can squeeze in before we run out of time. I think we're about midway, which is looking good. So what activities might require surveys, advice or mitigation? There's lots of things is the simple answer to that. But hopefully many of the common things can be summed up by the points that we've got on screen here. So if you're going to be altering a water body, so physically altering the channel or the banks, you might need to talk to somebody about that. If you're doing any temporary or permanent dewatering, so damming a river and dewatering it, perhaps to install a culvert or dig a trench to install an electricity cable or something of that ilk. If you've got temporary or permanent channel diversions, in channel works or nearby works which might affect water quality, aquatic habitats, or cause disturbance through noise or vibration or perhaps lighting. These are all things that you perhaps need to think about. And then of course you've got actual incidents as well, actual pollution incidents. So essentially, if your activities have the potential to affect aquatic habitats or species, either physically, chemically, or by the noise or light disturbance, for example, then you might want to seek advice about that. And of course, if you've already impacted something, you might want to know how severe or extensive that impact was and what remediation might be required. And that's something aquatic ecologists can advise on too. So here's our first case study then. Pardon me. So this site was a very small watercourse, as you can probably see from the photographs that we've got up here. There was very little water due to dense vegetation, or very little visible water due to the dense vegetation. And in fact, water depths within that channel were quite shallow, predominantly less than 4 centimetres. The stream is being surveyed ahead of a planned road crossing. And we found juvenile sticklebacks. You can see that very cute one in the top right there. And also white-clawed crayfish. So it was well worth us doing the surveys to highlight that those things were present. And those surveys were then used to inform subsequent mitigation. Move on to our second case study then. Access was required here for plant on a construction site, and a small watercourse was modified and diverted without prior surveys. It was that whole thinking again, it was a bit of a small ditch. It wasn't really something they needed to worry about. There were some concerns raised about water quality and runoff further downstream though, so we were asked to attend site, and whilst we were attending site looking at those issues, our surveyors observed some small fish trapped in very shallow and muddy water, not looking all too happy. So we undertook an emergency fish rescue, and we removed 50 stickleback and safely translocated those downstream. And following that, we provided advice on measures to prevent runoff of silty water into the watercourse, and also highlighted the importance to our client of considering things like fish or other aquatic life at the very start of projects, and not just ruling them out based on the size of the watercourse. So this is our third study then. Not the nicest of sites, this one. There was a very unpleasant smell emanating from a pond and a small watercourse adjacent to a housing construction site. So our client requested water quality surveys, which included macroinvertebrate surveys. And what we found when we were on site, in addition, I mean, there's visually something you can see is not quite right with this site. And even if you look at the lagoon on the bottom right, you can see there's on the far bank, there's a sort of film or sheen to the surface there, which didn't look altogether healthy to us. But our results from the water quality surveys and macroinvertebrate surveys provided strong evidence of sewage pollution. And we were able, through a strategic sampling plan, to trace back to the likely origin of those contaminants. And that helped our client then stop the contamination continuing. And we were able to advise on remediation following that. So our fourth site, as I said, I did put quite a few of these smaller watercourses in just to really try and highlight the importance of them. I think when you've got a big river or big lake, people will automatically start thinking we might need to consider aquatic ecology. But sometimes these tiny little streams and ditches, there might be a view amongst people that aren't in the know that they're not so important, or there won't be anything that important in them, and often that's really not the case. So in this example, the client needed to cut a small trench across a very small watercourse. I think this was to install an electricity cable, and we were asked to advise on potential constraints. A little bit of a desk-based background search showed that white-clawed crayfish had been recorded within the wider area, so surveys for those were recommended. And we went out and found quite a lot of white-clawed crayfish, including this rather large one that you can see in the top left picture there. That's probably one of the largest white-clawed crayfish that I've seen, I think. First, when I saw it, I thought it was a signal crayfish. It was that big, but yeah, definitely got the bumpy surface to its claws, which told us it was a white-clawed crayfish. So we found lots of those on site, and that survey then informed mitigation, which included a search for and transportation of crayfish immediately before works and a watching brief during works, just in case any of the crayfish revealed themselves whilst they were actually starting to dig. So this one, KCD5, another small water course, very little visible water due to dense vegetation, and the stream was being dewatered for culvert installation. And the contractors on site were apparently laughing at our surveys when they turned up, saying it was a waste of time and money and there were no fish in there. We were the supposed experts. They're just the usual sort of banter. I don't think there was anything, any malintent there. It was just a bit of banter. But our guys got in, and the contractors on site were eating their words quite quickly, because we pulled out 10 brown trout up to 20 centimetres long. So it just goes to show, again, these smaller water courses shouldn't be neglected or forgotten about. They really do need careful thinking about, because there can be some interesting things within them. Case study 6, so I threw a still water one in here. So in this case, the client began dewatering a pond because they believed it didn't have any fish in it. They'd asked locals and landowners, and they said no, there were no fish in it. Nobody had ever stocked it. So they started drawing down the water body, and during that process, some of the contractors on site thought they saw some fish moving, so they contacted us for advice. We were able to get somebody out on site pretty quickly. Whilst they were on site, they also saw fish moving. So works were stopped whilst we undertook an emergency fish rescue and translocation. We were able to do that quite promptly, thankfully. One of the issues with fish surveys and fish translocations is that you have to have Environment Agency consent before you can use things like seine nets or electrofishing equipment. And there's usually a minimum sort of, or up to 3-week turnaround period for that. Recently has been taking a bit longer due to resourcing issues at the Environment Agency. We can often turn things around a little bit quicker because we know quite a few of the fisheries officers, but it's not always a guarantee. So it really is important to try and think of these things in advance, particularly if you're on a tight program. The last thing you want is a 3-week delay when you've already started works on site. But in this instance, we were able to turn things around pretty quickly for the client, and we got out on site and rescued more than 30 fish, including pike up to 65 centimetres and then tench up to 30 centimetres. Some of the fish that we removed did also have strike marks, probably from heron or cormorants or something like that. And there was probably an increased frequency of that because this watercourse had been being drawn down over several days. So as it's drawn down, the water becomes shallower. It makes it easier for predators to spot the fish. And it's also congregating, it's making them, a lot easier to find because there's going to be more fish in a much smaller area as well. Case study 7, so I have thrown an estuarine one in here. This was again quite an interesting project that we did. So the client wants to replace an existing concrete head wall. You can see it in the bottom picture there. But the site's located in an tidal estuarine environment that's part of a marine conservation zone. So we undertook some habitat surveys in addition to sediment sampling, and those surveys found tentacled lagoon worm, which is a designated species of that marine conservation zone and is considered a highly vulnerable species. It's also afforded protection with the Wildlife Countryside Act. And the estuary of concern is one of only a few locations within that region where tentacled lagoon worm is known to occur. So following those surveys, we provided advice on appropriate mitigation, which included the potential translocation of sediments which may contain lagoon worms. And in fact, I think that project's still ongoing. So we may still be translocating tentacled lagoon worms yet. I should add, it sounds quite a glamorous species, the tentacled lagoon worm. It's only a few millimeters long. I was quite disappointed when I actually saw a picture of this one. So I shouldn't say that, the small things are quite nice too. Case study 8 then. So this was a project down in the south, and the client needed to dewater sections of a river to install flood defences. Habitat survey that our guys undertook confirmed the likely presence of lamprey amethysts based on the habitat that they saw there. We knew there'd need to be fish rescues at multiple locations, so where they were installing all these different defences, they needed to dewater the river so that they could work in the dry. But we knew that any lamprey that were caught during those fish rescues would need to be translocated to a suitable receptor site. So a lot of the other species, so the trout you can see, or trout and salmon part in that picture, I think, in the bottom right-hand picture, they're quite mobile species and they'll redistribute themselves quite readily. But lamprey amethysts have quite specific habitat requirements. So we needed to make sure that wherever we moved them to, there was going to be suitable habitat for them in that location. So habitat surveys were undertaken outside of the working area, and they were used to identify those receptor sites for lamprey amethysts. It was quite a challenging project because we were constantly being, the timescales were constantly changing due to heavy rainfall and high river flows. They had construction issues on site, all manner of different things. So it was constantly evolving and constantly changing, but we were able to quite quickly adapt and meet our clients' needs on that one. So I was quite proud of what we did there. And in addition to lampreys, we found lots of other species and relocated them, and some of those species you can see listed on the screen there. Case study 9 then. So in this case, the client was discharging cooling water. I've just spotted a typo there. Cooling water into a canal, and they wanted to apply for consent to discharge that water at warmer temperatures than they were doing currently. So we undertook some baseline ecology surveys to feed into an impact assessment, and that impact assessment demonstrated a potential increased risk associated with invasive bivalve mollusks that were already present in the canal, but it's deemed that those higher temperatures might cause them to breed and proliferate a little bit quicker. So we provided advice to the client on how they could mitigate those risks. So time to wrap up. I think we're just about keeping to time as well, which is good. So I've put some take-home messages here just to sort of finish off with. Essentially, if you're working on a site that's got aquatic features, so whether that's ponds or lakes, or streams or rivers, or an estuary or a canal even, and you might affect them in some way, shape or form, whether that's physically or chemically, or through light disturbance, you should probably speak to an aquatic ecologist. The size of the water body doesn't necessarily affect the likelihood of sensitive features or species being present, and hopefully some of my case studies have flagged that. You know, it's not just about the big rivers and the big lakes and those sorts of things. Some of those tiny little watercourses can actually hold things that we need to be concerned about too. Polluting watercourses is an offence, and that includes silt runoff. Probably one of the commonest causes of pollution in our rivers is silt runoff, whether that be from construction sites or roads or agricultural land. Causing harm or disturbance to aquatic species or habitats can be an offence, especially spawning habitat and spawning species. We certainly don't want to be adversely impacting those sites. Not checking on potential ecological constraints before works commence can result in delays to work, additional unexpected costs, and potentially legal or reputational consequences. It's not just about doing the right things legally. You don't want your reputation tarnished by ignoring something and ending up with, you know, dead fish lying around everywhere, or dead crayfish, or whatever it is. And the last one there, I think this is the key take-home message, is if in doubt, make a call. You can call me or any of my colleagues. As the BBC would say, other aquatic ecology consultancies are available. You can speak to any of them. Of course, we'd rather you spoke to us. But pick up the phone and ring someone, and perhaps when you do that, just have your site location details ready so we can maybe have a look at it on Google Maps look at some aerial photographs. And if you've got any photographs taken on site of the features that you're concerned with, perhaps pop them over to us in an email whilst we're on the call, just so we can have a quick look at those for you. But that initial call, 10 or 15 minutes on the phone, will cost you nothing, and it might save you a lot of hassle further down the line. And I think that's it for this one. So I've just put my contact details up on the screen there, so you can all make a quick note of my email address or phone number. I'm more than happy for you to contact me after the webinar if you've got any questions. I think some of you have also been posting questions in the chat, so I think Tim's going to ask a couple of those me in a minute. If we don't manage to answer all of your questions within this time slot we've got for the webinar, then don't worry, I will take those questions away and get back to you following that. But if you've got something urgent, by all means, drop me an email or give me a call independently. Thanks everyone for listening, and over to Tim.
Thanks very much, Pete. Yeah, and extra special thanks for persevering with your cold. If you can just bear with us for a little while longer, we do have quite a few questions. I'm going to kick off with one that came in early on, which was, if I needed to dam a small brook to install a culvert, would I legally need to do a fish rescue?
It's a good question, actually, and it's one that we've been asked recently. So my assumption always was, well, of course you need to do a fish rescue, because why would you want to leave potentially fish high and dry and suffocating and flapping? The wording of the legislation is a little bit grey, if I'm honest, and I've actually challenged some of my Environment Agency contacts on this one, saying, you know, what is the definitive ruling on this? Usually, if you do it, first and foremost, you would normally, if it's in a larger river, you'd want consent from the Environment Agency, and they would stipulate that you need to do a fish rescue, and then it becomes a legal requirement. Similarly, if it's a smaller watercourse, you'd probably be dealing with your local council. More often than not, they'll consult with the Environment Agency, but if they don't, they'll know what's gone on before, and they'll be saying you need to do it, so then it becomes a requirement. If that isn't the case, then it falls down to what might be present. And if you remember, I mentioned about the Salmon and Freshwater Fisheries Act. If there's potential for immature fish or spawning fish to be present, and you were to cause harm or death to those, then that would probably comprise an offence. So you could be in some pretty hot water with that. And I would say for the majority of the time of year, there's a chance that there's going to be, at least if there aren't spawning fish present, there could well be immature fish present. So there are very few periods of the year that you could undertake that work without risk of some of those being present. So bottom line is, if you are going to dewater a part of a watercourse, I would strongly recommend that you get a fish rescue done.
Okay, thanks, Pete. Another one here. How would I know if I need to think about crayfish for my project?
How would you know if you needed to think about crayfish for your project? Background data search would be the easiest way to do that. So for native crayfish, and in fairness, a lot of the invasive crayfish species, there will be records at local record centres. That's not always the case, though. So there are some smaller watercourses in particular where perhaps surveys have never been done, or where that information could be quite outdated. And in those cases, you probably want to have a look at the habitat that's available first. What we tend to say to clients is we can send somebody out to do a habitat assessment, and one of the things that they're looking for is suitable refuges. There's also things, so for native crayfish, for example, you might be looking at water depths and water quality. But if they're going out on site and doing that walkover survey anyway, they could probably go in and check some of those refuges for you. So it's probably as easy just to commission the habitat assessment and the crayfish survey at the same time. But a background data search would be the first starting point for you.
Okay, thanks. Would slow release of water from a flood attenuation pond be classed as discharge?
Say that again, Tim.
Would slow release of water from a flood attenuation pond be classed as discharge?
Probably one for the Environment Agency rather than me, that one, but I would say yes, because you're still discharging out of that water. Presumably it's from an attenuation pond, and you're discharging it into another watercourse, if that's what you're asking. And I would say yes, that would probably still constitute a at discharge, and you'd want to know what was contained within that. So slow discharge might be a way of mitigating any potential adverse impacts, but you would still probably need a permit to do that.
Okay, thank you. Are there any limitations on translocating fish into different water catchments? And as the second question, I guess linked, do you have to carry out a health check?
Yes and yes is the quick answer to that. So if you're moving fish from one water body to another, in almost all cases, there are some exceptions, but in almost all cases, you'll need to do a fish health check for that. So you'll need Environment Agency consent. You need consent to capture the fish because you'll be using, say, nets or electrofishing equipment or something like that. So you need Environment Agency consent for that. And as part of that application process, you'll need to say what you're doing with the fish once you've caught them. Will you be returning them to the same water body? And if the answer is no, they're going, you know, from one pond to another or from one river to another, then you'll almost certainly need a fish health check. And that's basically to prevent the risk of spreading diseases. So if you've got fish living in one pond, they might be carrying some horrible nasties that you don't want to move to another pond, or similar for, you know, moving them from one river to another. And it's not just fish that we're concerned about, you know, there are all sorts of other things. If you're moving fish from a river where signal crayfish are about, you need to think about biosecurity risks associated with that as well.
Okay, there's one here that's quite good timely, I should say, Pete. Somebody's asking whether we carry out bathymetric surveys.
We do carry out bathymetric surveys, and it is quite timely. So we've got people in-house who can carry out bathymetric surveys in all types of environments. So we've recently just done one in a dock system. Our guys in the past have done them in rivers and reservoirs and used for all sorts of different reasons. So sometimes just for mapping water depth. So I know they've been used to inform reservoir drain downs in the past. We've used them to estimate silt depths for people who want to remove silt from the bottom of water bodies and those sorts of things. But yeah, we can do bathymetric surveys.
Okay, cool. One here is if the client wants to lay an underground electricity cable underneath a wet drainage ditch circa 5 inches deep, do I need an aquatic survey?
Say that one again, Tim, please.
If a client wants to lay an underground electricity cable underneath a wet drainage ditch roughly 5 inches deep, do I need an aquatic survey?
So if you're referring to the drainage ditch having 5 inches of water in it, if it's permanently wetted, so if there's always a bit of water in it, then I would say yes, you should have somebody taking a look at that. If it periodically dries up, I'd be doing a background data search first just to check, because there are some species, so invertebrates, there are some snails, for example, that might be important. Depends on where you are in the country. If you're saying the electricity cable is going 5 inches underneath the thing, I can't imagine that would be the case. Actually, I'd imagine.
No, my reading of that was that it was the water itself is 5 inches. Yeah. Okay, this one's a bit of an open one, and I might take this as the last one, I think, because we're starting to run out of time. Recent news coverage has shown that all our rivers are polluted. What needs to happen to change this? There you go. Solve the problem, Pete.
Solve the problem. It's a complicated problem, and that's the issue. So there are, particularly for some of our major rivers, I'm not far from the River Wye, which has been in the news an awful lot, and I've seen those impacts firsthand. The ranunculus beds that used to be hugely prolific within the River Wye when I first moved to the area 3.5 years ago, are now almost non-existent. And it's quite sad and worrying to see. The cause of those pollution are complex, and that's why solving those problems makes it a very difficult task. So if we take the Wye catchment, for example, there's a lot of things of blame being pointed at chicken farms and intensive chicken farms, and saying there are too many within the catchment. there's no doubt that that's been having an impact, and runoff from those farms is certainly contributing to water quality issues, so heightened nutrient levels within the river. But in addition to that, we've got runoff from other agricultural land. So there are cattle farms within the catchment that are contributing to it. There's muck spreading on agricultural fields and fertilizer spreading that's contributing to it. But there's also discharges from wastewater treatment works. And I think what we need to do is look at all of those different things in combination. There are answers to most of them. In some cases, the answer is just a change in the way that people are undertaking those activities. And in some cases, that might even actually benefit. So in the case of farming, changing the way that farmers manage their land to prevent that pollution might actually result in benefits for them as a farm, result in less cost to them as a farm. So there can be win-wins, and sometimes it's just a change in mindset. You know, it's the way that people have always done it. Why should they change? Well, actually, there's benefits to both the farm and the environment. In the case of discharges from wastewater treatment works, money is unfortunately the answer. So it needs investment in infrastructure. We've got an ever-increasing population, and an ever-increasing population means more houses and more sewage, and that sewage needs to be treated and needs to go somewhere. And we currently don't have the infrastructure or the facilities available to cope with that. And I think when people were sort of planning them many years ago, they never realized that populations would get as big. So reducing the population, that would probably be one of the biggest answers, wouldn't it? But I'm not sure we're allowed to do that. And as a man with another baby on the way, I'd be quite hypocritical if I said that's what we need to do.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks, Pete. And thanks again for persevering with your cold. Thanks for everybody else that's joined us today. I hope you've enjoyed it as much as I have. The last thing I wanted to say was with our next First Thursday Club will be on the 5th of May. And we don't have a title for it yet, but it's going to be on biodiversity net gain and BNG. So hopefully we'll get lots of you back for that. Just a quick reminder that we'll be sending out the questionnaire after this, and hope you all have a good rest of your day, and we'll see you next month. Thanks very much.
Everyone, thanks, Tim.